From BRIC in downtown Brooklyn, I'm MacKenzie Fegan, and this is Glitter and Doom. If you're joining us for the first time, the Doom part of the show is the usual suspects. Racism, sexism, homophobia, systemic inequality, climate change, all the fun stuff. The Glitter? Each week I'll be talking to artists or cultural creators who are fighting back through their work, and we'll be taking a few detours along the way. Late last year, you couldn't turn on the news without hearing about the Caravan, the name the media used to describe the roughly 4,000 men, women, and children moving in groups big and small from Central America across Mexico to the U.S. border. Caravan. While a traditional reading of the word might evoke caftaned merchants traveling together on camelback through hostile deserts, a more contemporary usage brings to mind a joyous carnival or a lovable but unwashed group of friends heading to the Glastonbury Festival. In either case, the word describes a mass, a collective noun, a hashtag squad. Calling these roughly 4,000 people simply the Caravan made it harder for us to view them as individual humans with individual human reasons for undertaking a dangerous journey. Which is why the film Midnight Traveler is so urgent. It follows a family of refugees, not from Central America, but from Afghanistan, as they make the harrowing trek to the EU, seeking asylum. What sets this documentary apart is that the director of the film is also its protagonist. It personalizes the issue of migration in a way that is all too unusual today. We, of course, wanted to have the director of the film, Hassan Fazili, on the show, but unfortunately, he is not free to travel to the United States. But we were pleased to welcome two members of the film's creative team, Emelie Mahdavian and Sue Kim. Well, I wanted to thank you guys for joining me today. Emelie Mahdavian, Sue Kim, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
So you have a film called Midnight Traveler that is out in theaters now. You were both producers on it, and Emelie, you also wrote and edited it. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit broad strokes about the film.
So the film is about an Afghan family, Hassan Fazili, who's a filmmaker, his wife Fatima, who's also a filmmaker, and their two daughters. And they find themselves in the position of having to travel the migrant smuggling route to Europe when the Taliban puts a price on his head.
So the film opens with a family in Tajikistan. Why do they find themselves there?
So Hassan, like I said, was a filmmaker. His wife was an actress on Afghan television. And they're living a really sort of middle-class, normal life in Kabul. And he was hired on a project where he made a documentary that profiled Taliban fighters who laid down arms. And it aired on Afghan national television. And after it aired, the Taliban assassinated the main subject of the film. And he was just extremely fortunate through a friend that he heard that he was also next on that hit list.
Why do they flee to Tajikistan, and what do they do once they're there?
Well, Tajikistan is a Persian-speaking country, so for a Dari-speaking Afghan, it's a common language, and it's a safe country relatively. Afghanistan is landlocked, so you have limited options, and from where they lived, and given the connections that they had, that was the best place to get to quickly and to get a visa to enter quickly.
Sue, I want to ask you, how did you become involved in this project?
I saw the material, and what really drew me to it was the fact that it was from this perspective of the people who are actually going through the journey. Most of these kind of images are from outsiders, and while still valid, but they're from a very journalistic point of view, or from people who are not going through the experience. So this sort of being so personal was deeply affecting. You could really relate to the family and what they're going through and their little girls, and you wonder yourself, what would I do if I was in this situation and this really horrible thing happened to me? And it's a great way to open up a dialogue about this issue of migration.
You do feel a real intimacy with the family because it's shot first person and because you are in small enclosed spaces with them so often. It is entirely unlike any other film that I've seen that has a more journalistic or third person lens on it. The film is shot on cell phone. Tell me a little bit about that process. What was he using, and why did Hassan decide that he wanted to do this while his family was fleeing?
Well, so it was shot on 3 cell phones because he and his wife and his older daughter were all filming. So it's actually multi-perspectival. It's the whole family filming together and filming each other. And the cell phones were really just a necessity of the situation that they were in. There wasn't, any way that they could have done it with professional cameras. And the reason for doing it was really because that's who they were. They're filmmakers. They wanted to document what was happening to them, in their life, and they felt that this was something meaningful that they could do to transform their own situation when nothing else in their life was under their control.
Was there an end goal in mind? Were they thinking, at the end, we're going to have a feature film that we're going to submit to Sundance? Or was it just more, we're going to document this as we go along for posterity?
Initially, it was really just about documenting it for whatever it would turn out to be. And when I talked to them about it, we knew that we were maybe trying to make something. Would it be a short film? Would it be a sort of episodic piece? We didn't know how large the story would turn out to be. But it became clear relatively quickly that it was, large enough to sustain a feature film.
And so at what point did you come into the mix, and how did you connect with the filmmakers?
So I wrote my dissertation on Tajikistan and filmmaking during and after the Tajik Civil War, and I had made a film in Tajikistan, so I connected with them through that community, and I came on board from the beginning.
And do you speak Dari?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm a Persian speaker, so we did all that work in Persian.
And so you met them when they were in Tajikistan applying for asylum to other countries. Mm-hmm. They were rejected. Mm-hmm. Do we know why?
Yeah, mostly. I mean, it's a complicated system where a refugee and an asylum seeker are not the same thing. A migrant is a third category. And it's possible to kind of fall between the cracks of those systems, basically. Tajikistan is a country that had passed a bunch of anti-refugee laws that limited the ability of international organizations or other countries to provide support or aid to people from within Tajikistan. So basically, it was just a really unfortunate circumstance that caught up a lot of people who were seeking some kind of asylum or refugee support from inside the country.
So even if you had a valid claim, like the Fazilis did, if you were applying from within Tajikistan, because of bureaucracy, your application was unlikely to be accepted?
It was, there was various extreme limitations that were placed on what kind of support you could receive. So they did have the identical case at the beginning of the film that they have at the end of the film. And you see that from one physical location, that meant that they couldn't receive protection, and from another, they could, and the interim was this extremely traumatic journey.
So they were aware that if they wanted to increase their chances of being accepted as asylum seekers, that they would physically have to go to the EU.
Yeah.
Where do they go from Tajikistan?
Back to Afghanistan, then to Iran, and then to Turkey. From Turkey to Bulgaria, from Bulgaria to Serbia, Serbia to Hungary, and currently they're in Germany.
And this is over the course of how many years?
Basically 2 years from when they left Tajikistan to Germany.
I mean, the part that is really shocking as a viewer is that you see the passage of time through the girls, particularly Zara, the younger, who starts out basically as a baby, and by the end is like, 4 or 5? It's just a real physical manifestation of how long their journey takes and how much waiting there is involved, too. The longest chunk is when they're in a refugee camp in Serbia.
Yes.
Is that right? What are they waiting for?
So in Serbia, they were waiting for their names to come up on a list that would allow them to go to Hungary and put in an application to the Hungarian government. And there's a lot of people on that list, and some of the people end up leaving the list and trying smuggling routes through other countries. But the legal route is to wait for your name to come up, and in that case, it was 14 months.
And why was Hungary the end goal in that case?
Well, Hungary is the edge of the Schengen zone of the EU. So in Serbia, they're not inside the EU, and in Hungary, they are.
So you knew of Hassan's idea about making a film from this voyage before he set off. Mm-hmm. How did you guys work together? How did you stay in touch while he was sleeping in the forests of Turkey trying to cross the border? And how did he get footage to you?
Mobile phones are remarkable. They have reception all over, so we were in touch through the mobile phones. The footage, I just arranged people to meet them and copy the footage off of their media cards onto hard drives and mail the hard drives to me so that I could keep the footage safe while they were traveling.
It's so confounding to me that you're able to move the information, the actual footage, the cuts back and forth so freely that you were able to have people meet him in countries and bring the footage or upload the footage. And meanwhile, you're watching this incredibly arduous physical journey that people are making and these borders that are not porous. Knowing the process behind that is actually, it's just in such stark contrast, I think, to the film that you see.
Right. That the footage is able to go places that they're not, right?
Right, right. Yeah. Sue, how did you have a sense of how you would know when you were done? I mean, this took 3 years, right, from the beginning of the story. And it ends, we should say, with their asylum claim being accepted. But were there points along the way where you're like, this could go on forever, we should just end the story now?
There was some degree of urgency in getting the story completed and having the film released as soon as possible. And when the funding was in, that was possible. So we had there was a lot of time in Serbia. And so I think that kind of we were getting to a place where, well, we'll see where we are at the end of the editing process. And I guess it takes you don't know what's going to happen, but towards the end of our edit, they were in Hungary.
When we saw that footage, it was like, this is Europe, this is the ending of the film. It felt like a very clear stopping place. Because, of course, the refugee story or the asylum seeker story or the migrant story goes on for years. You could, if you wanted to follow something to its conclusion, you could still be filming this story. Sure. Because these are stories that have long, long end lives.
The film premiered at Sundance. Was the family able to come to the premiere?
No, they were not able to come to the premiere. At that time, they still don't have passports, so travel is difficult. And I think, with the pending, case, with an open case, it's really difficult to travel.
With the fact that Hassan and his family can't travel, weren't able to be at Sundance, how do you guys think about being the spokespeople for this film? Do you feel certain responsibilities knowing that you have to speak for him in many cases?
Well, that's awkward, I think, because part of what the film is trying to do is allow the family to speak for themselves. So part of what we have to do is try to let the film do its own work and then frame what the film does for people or answer their questions about how it was done. And but we don't want to be speaking for the families, so it's a little bit strange because it puts us in a position that is exactly what the film itself is trying to avoid doing.
What do you hope that American audiences take away from watching this film? It must have been surreal. I mean, right, this premiered when the caravan was happening. We have a parallel situation here in the U.S. What do you hope that Americans are thinking about when they watch Midnight Traveler?
Well, I think Sue and we feel like there's this very heightened rhetoric, and like Sue said, so much of what we get is from either a journalistic lens or from this very polarized, lens of either very pro or very anti refugees and immigrants. And we're hoping that the film is a film that kind of creates a space to set that aside and be with this family over this long journey and really feel firsthand for yourself what this is like and be able to ask yourself what you would do in this circumstance. And then maybe afterwards there's a conversation that you can have with your family or within your community about these wider issues that the film is framed within, but that for that 87 minutes you're with this one family on their journey.
I mean, I think that's the goal, is that the film can really open up a way to talk about these issues. And one of the, I think, things is that in America, it's not taking place in America. So it gives it sort of this like way of someone being outside it to look at it.
I'm curious about if it has changed the way you think about borders at all, working on this film.
I think it's a yes and no question. It's really, I don't think you can just like flat out and say like, okay, you know what, I'm gonna like move to New York City. I'm from wherever you may be from. I think there needs to be some way of regulating something, but I do think that what the real issue is that I think there's no protection for people who are in these very difficult situations, and that's really the issue.
Yeah, I mean, in their case, what we see is, I think a lot of the conversation is around, should there be borders or should there not be borders? And when I'm talking about like creating space for another conversation, it's in part to get around that, because here you have a family that gets a visa to legally go to Tajikistan and then does everything they can, puts in 50 applications to all these different places with a totally valid asylum claim saying, please someone help us, and finds themselves forced onto a migrant route. Forced to put their kids through this terrible trauma, in the hands of smugglers who are pretty unscrupulous, and some pretty terrible things happen to them. I think we see how broken that bureaucratic system is and how much trauma the system itself is inflicting on people who were trying to use the system in a legal way. So aside from borders or not borders, I mean, we see that at some kind of human level, the system is just really damaging the people that are trying to access basic safety.
You see the family in some of these incredibly vulnerable positions, and I'm thinking of the scene where a smuggler comes and says that unless they give him more money, he's going to kidnap their daughters. Or even when they reach, relative safety in Bulgaria, and there are nationalist gangs and they are subjected to violence, and one of the girls almost gets hit. Those moments are contrasted with clips that feel like home videos. How did you, as an editor, how did you strike that balance between those moments of levity and actually needing to show the actual seriousness on the ground?
Well, that was really about looking at what the footage was and trying to work with what the footage was, and recognizing that what the family was documenting was a harrowing journey, but it was also their story, and part of their story was that their kids were growing up, and they are people who have a sense of humor, and they are people who wanted to still have joy in their lives. And so it wouldn't have been true to their story to create a film about people who were just constant victims for 3 years. It was much more true to who they were and to what the story was, to include this lightness and to show that they were doing everything they could to maintain a sense of agency, to maintain a sense of humanity and normalcy in the midst of that awful system that they were caught in.
What was really beautiful was to see these two little girls growing up, in this like very terrible situation. And I think Nagis is a very special young lady, and I just loved the way she played. And one of the times when we're first introduced to her, she's in Turkey and the water is coming up, and she says the water is angry. And she's just so delighted by the fact that this water is like hitting her feet. And I feel like in an essence, like this is what this film is about, is like seeing that and like seeing, how she's growing up.
It's such a beautiful scene and so poignant too, because if you took that scene out of context, that would just be another home video, somebody's post on Instagram, an 8-year-old child visiting the sea for the first time, perhaps. But viewed within the context of the rest of the film, it's so heartbreaking. Tell me about the sound design and the score of the film.
It was a challenging thing to do because cell phone sound sounds like cell phone sound, and it's really hard to work with. And so that's where like the music, the composition came in really to kind of heighten that sense of like place and also of experience. And our composer, Gretchen Jude, she was very deliberate and very, she had a method for sort of the sound dealing with the music, and you had said that she had listened to all the cars that they were in, and she pulled chords from that, and that is like the basis of our score.
Yeah.
And that
Pulled
goes
chords from
the cars,
the sounds of the cars,
Yes.
or music that's on in the cars?
No, the
The
sound.
engine, she pitched the engines of each of the cars that they rode in, and she used those pitches to build a chord that's at the basis of the film score.
Emelie, do you have a favorite scene?
My favorite scene is when Fatima and Hassan have an on-camera fight, because it's a wonderful moment where it begins as a normal marital fight, and it seems like it's really just about appropriate behavior towards other women versus jealousy. Those are, kind of their two positions. And then it evolves into a conversation about the role of the artist in documenting life, and what are the boundaries of art and what are the boundaries of life. And it's a moment where his wife seems to see before he does some of the ethical challenges that are laying ahead in the road. And I also happen to know that's her favorite scene in the film. That's what she's told me.
I love that scene too, because he compliments a woman's appearance, a young woman's appearance. And in my head, when I was watching that, I was like, he shouldn't say that. And then his wife goes, you shouldn't say that.
Exactly.
That's a theme that emerges very strongly throughout the film, is sort of this line between artist, observer, and active participant, father, filmmaker. Right. Talk to me a little bit about that conflict that comes up for Hassan.
That's a common problem in journalism. It's a common problem in autobiographical filmmaking. But for him, at the beginning, film was this great opportunity to document what was going on. It was almost this, he had, I think, almost a utopian relationship to film. And his wife was much more pragmatic, much more focused on making sure that film didn't get in the way of taking care of their family and their safety. And it took him a little longer to have that crisis hit. And when it does hit, it hits him really hard.
Well, Sue, Emelie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.